Now that you learned the forms for the pronouns, we now have to learn the syntax, especially the syntax for the third person pronoun, which, like the adjectives, is translated certain ways depending on whether it's in what we call the independent position, the attributed position, or the predicate position. So you've been introduced to syntax before with the adjectives, and now you're going to learn a different syntax for the pronouns. Now, the most familiar use of the pronoun that most resembles English is that when a pronoun takes the place of a noun, it's said, no matter where that pronoun is being used, if it's used to replace the noun, it is said to be in what we call the independent position. So we're used to seeing pronouns used this way in this first function. And so some examples in Greek are aŭtos, estin, agathos. This is in the independent position, and here aŭtos is being used as the subject of the sentence. And we don't know what the antecedent is. It could be Jesus, it could be some other person. But the way we translate this is he is good. And we translate it as he because we see that case ending. We know that it's nominative, so it's going to be used as the subject of the sentence. It's singular and it's masculine. And so we translate it as he. And then the adjective, which modifies aŭtos, is also nominative, singular, masculine. So we know that we're translating this correctly. In the second example, he Jesus epen aŭto, aŭto is also a pronoun used to replace some other noun. There is an antecedent to aŭto, but here it's being used as an indirect object. And so as long as the pronoun takes the place of noun, it can be anywhere in the sentence. It can be the subject of the sentence, the indirect object of the sentence, the direct object of the sentence, the predicate nominative. But the most important thing is that we look at the case ending, and we know how to translate this form of aŭtos in English according to its case number and gender. So ha Jesus is a subject. Remember that it has the article, so it's likely the subject of the sentence. Jesus said. And what did he? And he said, in this case, aŭto is in the dative, so we translate it as to him. That omicron tells me that it could either be the nominative, the dative singular masculine, or the dative singular neuter, but since Jesus talking to a person is likely him, and so the translation would be Jesus said to him, and then whatever quotation follows. And this is the most frequently used form of the pronoun, where the pronoun takes place of a noun. The second function of the pronoun is what we call the adjectival intensive, translated as himself, herself, itself, or themselves in the plural. And this will take some getting used to, but the position of the pronoun will tell us whether to translate this as an adjectival intensive or not. And the position of the pronoun in the sentence that we're looking for is what we call the predicate position. And this is something that you've heard before when we talked about the module for the 2, 1, 2, and 2, 2 adjectives. We went over the syntax of the adjective, but now we're going over the syntax of the pronoun. So the pronoun has its own unique syntax. And for the adjectival intensive, when the pronoun occupies what we call the predicate position, it will be translated not as he, she, it, or any of the forms of the pronoun, but as himself, herself, itself, themselves, where the use of himself, etc., is to emphasize the agency of whoever is doing the action. So here's an example, Jesus aŭto epen, where there is no article, and we have two things in the nominative. We have Jesus, and then we have aŭtos, and both are nominative singular masculine. So we can guess that this is somehow modifying Jesus. And our translation would be in this case, Jesus himself said. You would not translate this as Jesus he said. That would be incorrect. That is not the right translation. Here, aŭtos is modifying Jesus like an adjective, although it's a pronoun. And the way we translate this in Greek is to use a form of himself, herself, itself, or themselves. It's a little bit clearer what the predicate position is when we actually introduce an article into the sentence. So this is what we call an anarthrous sentence because there's no article there. But in this sentence, it's articular, not anarthrous, because we have actually an article being used. And if we were to label the positions, we have aŭtos in what we would expect the adjective to be, the adjectival position, and this is a predicate adjectival position. Here's a definite article, and here is the noun Jesus, and then the verb. And whenever the definite article is attached to the noun, whatever is occupying the position of the adjective is what we call the predicate position. And we will learn in the third function that when the definite article is connected to the adjective, or what's functioning in the adjectival position, that's what we call the attributive position. But right now we're learning the predicate position. And when the pronoun aŭtos or its forms is in the predicate position, we will translate it as himself, herself, itself, or themselves, depending on whether the singular or plurals are being used and what gender is being used. So this sentence is also translated. Here is what's the subject, Jesus. And because aŭtos is in the predicate position, signaled by the fact that the definite article is adjacent to the noun, we would translate this as Jesus himself said. And we have the same predicate position, but in different word order here, where we have the noun, the definite article, the noun, and the adjective. Notice again, the definite article is adjacent to the noun, so whatever is in the adjectival position, in this case the pronoun, is in what we call the predicate position. This is the adjectival predicate position. We would also translate this as Jesus himself said. So here we have three different ways to say the same thing, but what's common is aŭtos is in the predicate position, clearly in the predicate position, and here because there's no article, it could be in the predicate position, or it could be in what we call the attributed position. Context will tell you, because no article is giving you a clue as to whether it could be one or the other. But in this case, since we're talking about the adjectival intensive, we translated it as a predicate position pronoun, and we translated this, therefore, as Jesus himself said. If the adjectival intensive wasn't very clear, I think if you compare it with the attributive use of the pronoun, what we call an identical adjective, translated as the same, where aŭtos, believe it or not, is not translated as he, or aŭte as she, or aŭta as it, but is actually translated as the same, where aŭtos is used like an adjective even though its parts of speech is a pronoun. And we know to translate this way when aŭtos is in the attributive position, not the predicate position. So here, in the examples we have, again, there is no article. And without the article there, without the article being present, we can't tell whether it's a predicate position or an attributive position. Last time we translated aŭtos simply as a predicate position because we're talking about the adjectival intensive use. But it could also be translated as if it was in the attributive position, because there's no article to tell us which way or the other. So we could have translated Jesus or Jesu aŭtos, Jesus aŭtos apen. as Jesus himself said. But we could also translate the exact same sentence as the same Jesus said. Where aŭtos, we have the noun here and the pronoun in the adjectival position. And this adjectival position, because we have no definite article, it's unclear whether it's attributive, as we translated it here, the same Jesus said, or whether in the previous slide we translate it in the predicate position as Jesus himself said. But with the other examples where we have an article, it will actually be very clear how to translate aŭtos. So in this case, we have the definite article, we have the pronoun in the adjectival position, and then we have the noun, and then the verb. And notice that the article, definite article, is not adjacent to the noun this time, it's adjacent to the adjective, or the pronoun in the adjectival position. This is what we call the attributive use of the pronoun aŭtos, and this would be translated as the same Jesus. And we can say the same Jesus said one more way, as long as the article and the pronoun are adjacent to each other, and therefore the pronoun is what we call in the attributed position in the sentence, we can translate this the same way. So in this case, we just simply have the subject first, the noun. But notice again, the definite article is adjacent to the pronoun in the adjectival position. This is a DA pattern, DA, where the article is being used. And therefore, we would translate this also as the same Jesus said. Now let's go over the nuts and bolts of parsing. And it's important to remember that the first and second person personal pronouns have a different parsing scheme than the third person pronouns. So when it comes to pronouns like I or we, the first person, or you all for the second person, these pronouns have a different parsing scheme, a slightly different parsing scheme than the third person pronouns he, she, it, and they. So when you parse first and second person pronouns, you have to identify the case, the number, and notice that there's no way to tell gender in the forms of I or we or you all. Instead, all you can identify is whether it's a first person pronoun or a second. And of course, you want to include the lexical form, and then you want to give the translation. So look at our example, hey Mace. How would I parse this? Well, this is the word for we, and it's nominative, it's plural, it's first person. There's no way to tell in the first and second personal pronouns whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter, so you leave that blank. Its lexical form is a go. Because this is the we is simply the plural form of I. But there are some lexicons that actually write out hemes and as the nominative, and I would accept both, but I think it's a good habit to remember that the lexical form for hemes is a go. And the translation here is we. But for the third person pronouns, you also identify case, number, and person. In this case, for third person, you would identify as a third person pronoun. But we actually have three separate forms for the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. So you can identify gender. So you have to make sure that you identify a gender in addition to case, number, and person. So identify the gender, then you have the lexical form, and then the translation. So let's look at aŭtos, this example. Notice that it has a feminine accusative plural ending. So this is aŭtos, is accusative, it's plural, it's a third person pronoun, and it's clearly feminine. And the lexical form for this is aŭtos, a, and I would actually put all three forms because the pronouns do function like a 2-1-2 adjective, although they are pronouns. And and if you remember, the neuter singulars for the nominative accusative forms are different, but otherwise it looks just like a 2-1-2 adjective. And then because this is accusative, and plural, I would translate this as them.